It was supposed to be just another afternoon, a quick walk home from school, earbuds in, lost in her own world. But for 16-year-old Maya, everything changed in an instant. She barely noticed the police car pull up beside her at first. The officer, a man with a cold, unreadable stare, stepped out and demanded to see her ID. Confused, she hesitated. "I didn't do anything," she said, her voice steady but uncertain. That was all it took. His expression hardened. In a matter of seconds, the situation escalated. Before she could react, she felt the sharp sting, hot, searing pain against her arm. A cigarette pressed into her skin. She gasped, eyes widening in shock, the acrid smell of burning fabric and flesh mixing in the air. The officer didn't flinch. Tears welled in Maya's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The officer just sneered. Then, from around the corner, a car screeched to a stop. The door flew open. A man stepped out, his suit crisp, his eyes burning with fury. Maya barely had time to register what was happening before she heard the words that changed everything. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Her father had arrived, and he wasn't just anyone, he was a lawyer. Maya's father, Jonathan Pierce, moved fast. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in every detail, the officer's stance, Maya's trembling hands clutching her burned arm, the way the street had fallen eerily silent. His heart pounded, but his voice was controlled. "What exactly is going on here?" His words were measured, but the fire beneath them was unmistakable. The officer shifted slightly, as if weighing his next move. "She was being uncooperative," he said flatly, his fingers still resting near his belt. "I had to ensure compliance." Jonathan's jaw clenched. He had spent years in courtrooms dismantling weak excuses like this. But standing here, looking at his daughter, his baby girl, hurt and afraid, it took everything in him to keep his rage from boiling over. Maya's voice broke the silence. "Dad, he just stopped me for no reason." Her breath hitched as she tried to hold back tears. "I didn't do anything." Jonathan took a step closer, putting himself between Maya and the officer. His mind raced. He needed to handle this the right way. This wasn't just about his daughter. This was about something bigger. He pulled out his phone, steady hands recording every second. "Badge number," he demanded. "And I want your supervisor here. Now." The officer didn't move at first, his face unreadable. But Jonathan knew one thing. This man had no idea who he had just messed with. And this fight, it was far from over. The officer's hand twitched near his radio, hesitating. He knew he should call it in, but something in Jonathan's eyes made him pause. This wasn't just some angry parent. This was a man who knew the law, a man who wouldn't back down. Maya pressed closer to her father, feeling a small wave of safety, but fear still clung to her. Her arm throbbed where the cigarette had burned her skin, and the officer's silence only made it worse. Would he deny it? Twist the truth? She had heard too many stories to think otherwise. A small crowd had started to gather. A woman across the street pulled out her phone, recording. A man in a business suit slowed his steps, watching closely. Whispers floated through the air. Jonathan knew this was good. Witnesses meant accountability, but it also meant pressure. He needed to keep his emotions in check. The officer finally spoke, his voice clipped. "You don't need to record this." Jonathan let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, I absolutely do. Because let's be clear, what you just did to my daughter is assault." The officer's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the crackle of a radio cut through the tension. Another voice came through. "Unit 4 to 7, what's your status?" For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the officer's face. He hesitated, then pressed the button. "I need a supervisor at my location." Jonathan's grip on his phone tightened. This was just the beginning. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken tension. Jonathan could see it now. The officer's unease, the shifting weight in his stance. He was no longer in control, and he knew it. But that didn't mean he was going to back down easily. Maya's breath was uneven beside him, and Jonathan fought the urge to check her burn again. He needed to stay focused. His daughter needed him to be sharp, not shaken. The radio crackled again. Supervisor en route. The officer's gaze flicked to the growing crowd, his fingers tapping restlessly against his belt. Jonathan could see it. He was calculating his next move. Was he going to double down on his authority? Try to twist the story before backup arrived. A black SUV turned the corner, slowing as it approached. The supervisor. The crowd shifted, murmurs growing louder. Before anyone could speak, Maya did. Her voice, small but steady. "Why did you do it?" The officer turned to her, his expression unreadable. Jonathan felt his stomach twist. His daughter wasn't just hurt, she was demanding answers. She wanted him to say it out loud. The SUV's door opened, and a tall, serious-looking man stepped out, his eyes scanning the scene. The officer stiffened. Jonathan exhaled slowly. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. And he wasn't about to let the truth get buried. The supervisor's eyes swept over the scene, taking in the crowd, the officer's stiff posture, and Jonathan standing firm with his phone still recording. His expression remained unreadable, but Jonathan caught the quick glance he gave the officer, subtle but telling. He already knew something was wrong. Before Jonathan could speak, the officer did. This girl refused to cooperate. "I was ensuring compliance," he said, his voice steady but forced. Jonathan scoffed. "Ensuring compliance by burning her? That's assault, and you know it." He turned to the supervisor. "I want his badge number. I want a report filed, and I want to know why my daughter was stopped in the first place." The supervisor exhaled, then looked at Maya. "Is that true? He burned you." His tone was calm, but his gaze held weight. Maya swallowed hard and nodded, pulling up her sleeve slightly. The raw, angry burn on her skin was undeniable. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. The supervisor's face tightened. He turned to the officer, his voice low. "Is this how you handled the situation?" The officer didn't answer immediately, his jaw clenched. Then, in a move that no one expected, he reached for his own radio and muttered into it, requesting backup. Jonathan's stomach dropped. The energy shifted. This wasn't just about accountability anymore. This officer was calling for protection. Maya clutched his arm. "Dad." Jonathan knew now. They weren't just up against one cop. They were up against the system. The tension in the air was thick as another patrol car pulled up, lights flashing but sirens off. Jonathan's grip on his phone tightened. He knew exactly what this meant. The officer wasn't calling for justice. He was calling for cover. Two more officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their belts. The supervisor squared his shoulders and turned to the first officer. "You requested backup." The officer nodded stiffly, his expression unreadable. "I need assistance managing this situation." Jonathan let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "You mean you need someone to help you spin this?" His voice cut through the air, unwavering. "That's not going to happen." Before anyone could respond, a new voice spoke up. "Actually, I think we need to take this to the station." Jonathan turned to see a woman emerging from the crowd, dressed in a sleek blazer, her face familiar. His pulse jumped. Attorney Lisa Monroe, a civil rights lawyer he had worked with before, and from the way she was looking at the supervisor, she wasn't just another bystander. Lisa held up her phone, the screen still recording. "We have everything we need right here. Witnesses, video evidence, and a victim. So unless you want this to be tomorrow's headline, I suggest we handle this the right way." The supervisor hesitated. Then, with a slow nod, he turned to the officer. "Hand over your badge and weapon. You're done here." The crowd erupted in murmurs. The officer's face darkened, but he complied, jaw clenched. Jonathan exhaled, pulling Maya close. It was over. Or so he thought, until Lisa turned to him and whispered, "This isn't the first time he's done this. And if we dig deeper, we might find out just how far this really goes." Jonathan's breath slowed as the weight of the moment settled in. The officer was done, but Lisa's words lingered in his mind. How many others had been hurt before Maya? How many had been silenced? Maya leaned into him, her body still tense. "Is it really over?" she asked softly. Jonathan looked at her, then at Lisa, who was already making notes on her phone. He shook his head. "Not yet, but it will be." The crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring among themselves, some still recording, others shaking their heads. The other officers, sensing the shift in power, stepped back, waiting for orders from the supervisor. There was no way to spin what had happened now, not with witnesses, video evidence, and a lawyer standing right there. Lisa turned to Jonathan. "We'll press charges, file a civil suit, and I'll personally look into his record." She paused, lowering her voice. "You did the right thing today." Jonathan sighed, placing a protective hand on Maya's shoulder. "I just did what any father would do."